For homework, you are asked to read Chapter 7.1, pages 179 to 182, and complete exercises 7.1 on page 183, exercises A 1 through 5, and exercises B 1 through 7. Beginning with exercise 7.1a, you are given the following instructions. For each mood and figure, write out the syllogism it describes. So for problem number 1, you were given the following mood, which is I, and then first figure, figure 1. And the way to write this out is you begin by filling in each of the quantifiers that is expressed in the mood. So you know that A represents all, so we know it's going to be all blank or blank. We don't know if the subject is going to be the major term or the middle term. Then we know I represents a sum. I represents sum. Again, we don't know if the subject is going to be the minor term or the middle term. And then we have I. And so we know that the last proposition, the conclusion, it is going to be sum S or P. And we know that because S is always the subject of the conclusion and the predicate is always P. Then what we do is we fill in the middle term, and since we know this is first figure, the middle term is going to be the subject of the major premise. The major premise is the first premise, and it is going to be the predicate of the minor premise right here. And then once we do that, the rest is pretty easy. The major term comes in the major premise, which is the very first premise, and then the minor term comes right here. And so this is how you would fill this argument out. I should say, I know that chances are you're never going to be given the mood and figure and then asked to fill out an argument. However, this is a really good exercise because it teaches you to think through the location of all of these different terms, where the middle term is, where the minor term is, where the major term is, and it makes you kind of think backwards. And by doing that, you learn the information a little bit better. So moving right along, you are given the following mood, A, E, and figure 2. So we're going to do this one the exact same way, is fill in the quantifiers for the argument, and we know it's going to be all, no, and no. And like I said with the previous one, we always know the conclusion. We always know that S is going to be first and then P. And then second figure, hopefully you remember second figure is where the middle term occurs as the predicate of the major premise, and the middle term occurs as the predicate of the minor premise. Remember what I said, the W, where it slashes this way, that's first figure starts right here in the subject term of the major premise, slashes down, and then second figure is straight up. Okay? So we know that, and then the rest is pretty easy. We put our P and our S where they belong. Third problem. I 1. So we're going to do the same. We're going to fill in our quantifiers, sum, all, and sum, and we know first figure starts right here and slashes this way, and so put our M's there that represent middle term, and then put our P's, P and our S in. Number 4, E1, and we know that E represents a no. Excuse me, A is all and E is no. And we know this is first figure. First figure again starts as the subject term of the major premise, and it slashes across. And then once we figure that out, then we fill in our P and our S. Finally, EIO, this is going to be no, some not. And this is third figure. So if you remember, first figure starts right here and it slashes this way, and then second figure is up. Well, then hopefully you remember that the third figure is kind of the mirror opposite. So if, like I said, think of it in terms of a W, this slashes this way and up, then the mirror opposite would be down and this way. I don't know if that's making sense, but basically you can just look at the chart. And here's where we put our middle term, and then here's where we put our P and our S. Alright, so that was pretty straightforward, and I don't think too terribly difficult. It's just a matter of remembering the figure. That can be the trickiest part. So for exercise 7.1b, you are asked to put each of the following syllogisms into standard form and then identify the mood and the figure. So problem number 1, you were given the following argument. Any ambitious person can learn logic, and anyone reading this book is ambitious. So anyone reading this book can learn logic. Well, the first thing you have to do is you have to identify the conclusion. And here we have an indicator word, the word so. So we know that the last sentence here, it is our conclusion. So anyone reading this book can learn logic. The problem here we have is that this is not in standard form for the categorical proposition. Notice anyone is not one of our standard quantifiers. Anyone reading this book can learn logic. Can learn logic doesn't name a class of things, so we're going to have to fix this and put this proposition in the standard form. All people reading this book are people who can learn logic. Notice now it is in standard form. We have our quantifier. People reading this book names a class. We have our copula right here are. People who can learn logic also names a class. Now what we want to do is locate our major premise. We could locate our minor premise. It doesn't matter. We could do either one, but I just always go with the major premise. And what we're looking for is people who can learn logic. So any ambitious person can learn logic. Well, there we have it right there. And so that is going to be our major premise. This too is not in standard form, so we do need to correct this, and we need to get rid of any and use all, and we also need to insert a copula here, are, and we need to make sure that our subject and predicate name classes. So we'll rewrite it in the following way. All ambitious people are people who can learn logic. So here we have people who can learn logic, people who can learn logic. Right? So we have our major term up here, our major premise up here because it contains the major term, which is the predicate term of the conclusion. Now finally, what's left is this. Anyone reading this book is ambitious. Of course, this is not in standard form. It doesn't have the standard quantifier here. And in the subject, anyone, so ambitious doesn't name a class. Ambitious is an adjective. So we're going to need to change this a little bit and rewrite it in the following way. All people reading this book are ambitious people. Now what we want to do is figure out the mood and the figure. And the mood of this is all, so it's going to be A. Now what's the figure? Ambitious people, ambitious people. Notice it starts right here as the subject of the major premise, slashes down to the predicate of the minor premise. So this is first figure. So it's going to be AAA1. Number 2. No Greek poet was a genius because no Greek poet was eccentric and all geniuses are eccentric. Well, the first thing we have to do is figure out the conclusion. Now notice we have an indicator word right here, because. Anytime someone says such and such because, you know that whatever comes after the because is the justification. So this right here, all this that comes after because is justifying this first proposition. No Greek poet was a genius. So that is going to be our conclusion. Now genius does name, you might say a genius person, but I think genius is a term that does name a class. So we have our conclusion in place. Now what we need to do is we need to figure out what our major premise is. So what we do is we look right here. Our major term is genius, and we have to check out what we have. No Greek poet was eccentric. All geniuses. Oh, look right there. All geniuses are eccentric. And so we need to put that first. So notice here that our major, and this is our argument right here, but our major premise, which we're listing here, actually was the very last thing stated in this. So a lot of times you have to reorganize it. Look right here. The conclusion was actually stated first. Now, eccentric doesn't name a class. You know, genius or geniuses, that names a class. You can say the class of geniuses. But eccentric, you need to add a word, because eccentric is not, it is modifying something, which in this case would be people. So all geniuses are eccentric people. This is how we would rewrite this. Now, what we have to do finally is locate the minor premise, which was going to be no Greek poet was an eccentric person. And so this is our argument. It's in standard form: major premise, minor premise, and conclusion. All of our propositions are in standard form for propositions: quantifier, subject, names copula, predicate, and the subject and predicates both name classes. Now, what is the mood? It is going to be all, no, no. In other words, A, E, E. And then let's see, what is our figure? Notice that eccentric person is here, eccentric person is here. If you recall from the figure, its first figure starts in the subject term and slashes, second figure straight up. So this is going to be A, E, E, 2. That is the mood in the figure. Number 3. This one was actually the most fun and difficult in my opinion. I'm going to show you 2 ways to do this one. Some kids who play video games have poor language skills. No person with poor language skills does well in school, so some kids who play video games do poorly in school. The first thing we have to figure out is the conclusion, which we have an indicator word, so. So the conclusion is going to be some kids who play video games, and I'm just going to skip a step here, are people who do poorly in school. Are people who do poorly in school. Notice I added the word people here because we have, and I added the word are because we have to have our copula and the predicate has to name a class. Now what we want to do is figure out what our major term is. And what we're looking for is our major premise is. Our major term is people who do poorly. Now let's read back through this. Some kids who play video games have poor language skills. Well, that's not it. No person with poor language skills does well in school. Well, this says does well in school. We're looking for people who do poorly in school. So some kids who play video, well, look at this. People who do poorly doesn't occur anywhere else in the argument. Now the closest thing we have to it is this right here. No person with poor language skills is a person who does well in school. But this right here, person who does well in school, is not the same class that we're talking about down here. The class of people who do well in school and the class of people who do poorly in school, those aren't the same things. Now this seems like the best candidate right here. No person, this proposition, no person who does person with poor language skills is a person who does well in school, seems like the best candidate for the major premise, but it actually won't work as it's stated because again, we have to name the same class that we name right here has to be the same class that we name down here. And the class of people who do well are not the same people who do poorly. Those are just 2 different classes. Now you might be thinking, yeah, but they're very, very close in a certain way. And they are close. They're close insofar as they are complements of one another. The class of people who do well is the complement of people who do poorly. Now you might complain a little about that and say, well, technically it's not the class complement because the complement of people who do well are people who don't do well, which could be people who do mediocre. But we're just going to say people who do mediocre or people who are average, they're doing well. So the people who do well is the class complement of people who do poorly. So what we're going to have to do in order to get this argument to work is we're going to have to rewrite either premise 1, the major premise, or the conclusion in such a way that they are naming the same classes of individuals. And the way we do that is by obversion. We either find the obverse of the premise. I guess we could do it, in different ways, but the obverse works in every case and it's probably the simplest. But what we would do is we find the obverse of 1, and we find the obverse of 3. And I'll show you what I'm talking about. So let me just lay these out. So suppose let me back up a screen. Let's say we're going to find the obverse of 1. Now, hopefully you remember, when you find the obverse of an E-form proposition, or the obverse of any proposition, the first thing you do is you change the quality. And the quality here is negative, so we're going to have to make it affirmative. And then you find the complement of the predicate and the proposition. The complement of a person who does well is a person who does poorly. So it's going to be all... Oh, sorry. I got this in reverse order, so let's skip over here. All people with poor language skills are people who do poorly in school. This would be the obverse of this proposition right here. So this is one way we could do this argument. We could find the obverse of this proposition right here, and now what we've done basically is we've constructed an argument in which the predicate here is the same as the predicate here. The major terms line up because people who do poorly and people who do poorly, these things line up. On the other hand, we have another option, which is we could find the obverse of the conclusion. So the conclusion we started with was some kids who play video games are people who do poorly in school. But what we could do is find the obverse of this. So instead of saying are, we're going to have to change the quality to are not. And instead of saying people who do poorly, we have to say people who do well, which is what I did right here. Some kids who play video games are not people who do well in school. So I hope this isn't too complicated. I feel like I went over that a little quickly. And I got out of order a little bit there myself. But the point here, I want to back up just so you can understand this. The point here is that the major term is people who do poorly. And the problem we have is that the predicate here is not the same as the predicate here. The two classes are not the same, and we need to fix it. And we have one or two options before us on how to fix it. Either we can rewrite the conclusion so that the major term is the same in both the conclusion and the major premise. So we find the obverse of the conclusion, and by doing that, we're stating a proposition which is logically the same, but it's just worded a little bit differently so that we're naming the same class. And see, I've done that here. That's one option before us. Or we could rewrite the major premise. And by rewriting the major premise, we find the obverse of it. Again, we're going to change the quality. We're going to name the complement, but the effect it's going to have is that it makes the major term, that is the predicate here, the same as the predicate in the conclusion. So once we've done that, then the only thing left is to fill in the minor term, and that's going to be the same in both cases. Some kids who play video games are people who have poor language skills. Now, you could have done this argument either of these ways. Either way will work. Now, I'll tell you, the book, the answer it provided was the one on the left. But the truth is the one on the right would work the same. And I'll tell you this too, both of these arguments are valid. Later on, maybe I'll remember and I can show you why that is. But now what we're going to want to do is find the mood and the figure. So in this one, depending on how you approach this, it's going to change what the mood and what the figure is. But in this one we have E, I, O, and then let's look at what the figure is. A person with poor language skill, that is the subject term. Kids who play video games or people with, that is the predicate term here. So if the middle term is the subject of the major premise and it's the predicate of the minor premise, then we have first figure. E, I, O, 1. Over here, what we have is A, I, and then I. And it's going to be the same exact figure. The figure isn't going to change. So this one, like I said, it was the trickiest one because the major term was not the same as it was presented in the argument and the conclusion and in the major premise. So you had to find the obverse. I guess you could have done it a different way, maybe use one of the other logical equivalencies, but aversion was probably the easiest because obverse works in all cases. And what that does is, actually aversion would, I think, now that I think about it, might be your only option before you, because you had to, I think if you did the other ones, it would have affected the subject, and we didn't want to affect the subject, or we didn't want to affect the middle term at all. So I think aversion was the only one that was really available to you now that it occurs to me. But we found the obverse either of the conclusion, and what that did is it allowed us to change the major term so that it matched the major term in the major premise, or we found the obverse of the major premise, and that enabled the major terms to match in both cases. So that one was a little tricky. If you didn't get it, don't beat yourself up over it. That was hard. If you did get it, you deserve a pat on the back. Some books about vampires are not great works of literature. After all, no Twilight book is a great work of literature. Sorry to offend anyone who's a fan of Twilight, but this is this one guy's opinion. It might actually be a fact, but anyways, after all, no Twilight book is a work of great literature, and all the Twilight books are about vampires. Well, first things first, we need to figure out what the conclusion is. And the conclusion of this is some books about vampires are not great works of literature. And we have an indicator phrase here, after all. Again, this lets you know if someone says blah, 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 after all, then what comes after that is going to be the justification. So some books about vampires are not great works of literature. First thing, this is in standard form. This proposition is, we have a quantifier. Books about vampires are subjects, and it names a class. Our copula right here are not. And then great works of literature names a class also. So very good. Now what we want to do is figure out a major premise, which it's going to have great works of literature. So let's look up here. No Twilight book is a great work of literature. Well, there we go. No Twilight book is a great work of literature. And then all the Twilight books, or all Twilight books, are about vampires. So this one's actually pretty easy. This is a lot easier than the last one. And then what we want to do is figure out our mood, which is going to be no, or E, A, are not, O. E, A, O. And then let's figure out our figure. Well, look, Twilight books, Twilight books. Now, this is going to be third figure. So our mood and figure, EAO, figure 3. EAO 3. Number 5. Some dresses with tulle are red. No red dress is a wedding dress. Some dresses with tulle are not wedding dress. So some dresses with tulle are not wedding dresses. Now, what is the conclusion here? Well, we have an indicator term, so. So the conclusion is going to be some dresses with tulle are not wedding dresses. Now, let's look at this and make sure this is in standard form. Quantifier, dresses with tulle, that names a class, are not. There's our copula. Wedding dresses, yeah, everything's fine here. So we're looking for a proposition that has wedding dresses in it. Some dresses with tulle are red. Nope, no red dress is a wedding dress. Well, there we go. No red dress is a wedding dress. And then some dresses with tulle are red. Now notice red doesn't name a class of things. Oh, my animations got off, but red doesn't name a class of things, so I added dresses. If you just said some dresses with tulle are red, it wouldn't be in standard form due to the fact that red is an adjective. It doesn't name a class, so we have to name class here, red dresses. Now what we want to do is figure out our mood and figure, and it's going to be no, some not. So E-I-O, and then red dress here, slashed right here, red dress, so it's figure 1. There's a lot of figure 1s going on. All right. Number 6, some pro-military advertisements are not propaganda because some of them are truthful, and no truthful advertisement is propaganda. So we have to figure out our conclusion, and notice we have an indicator phrase here, because. And we know that anything that comes after that is going to be the justification, so the conclusion is right here. Some pro-military advertisements are not propaganda. So that is our conclusion. And let's make sure this is in standard form. Quantifier, pro-military advertisements, that names a group, copula are not, and propaganda. Yep, everything's good to go. So we're looking for a proposition that has propaganda in it. Some of them are truthful, and no truthful advertisement is propaganda. So no truthful advertisement is propaganda. That is going to be our major premise. And this is in standard form. No, there's a quantifier, truthful advertisement, subject, copula, predicate. Good. Then we have to find our minor premise, which is going to be some of them are truthful. So what is this referring to? Some of them, so it would be some pro-military advertisements are truthful. Now, notice here that truthful doesn't name a class. You need to add a word here. And you could have said truthful things, or but I just went with truthful advertisements because we already had truthful advertisements here, and so it made more sense to reuse that term so we had a consistent middle term. So let's figure out, this is an argument, we've put it in a standard form, what is our mood? And it's going to be no, which is E, I, and then are not, O. E, I, O is the mood, and then what is the figure? Truthful advertisement, going to be figure 1. Number 7. Some essential nutrients are not organic because no mineral is an organic substance, and some minerals are essential nutrients. So let's see, what is our conclusion here? Notice we have an indicator word because. What have we been saying? What comes after that is a justification. So it seems like the conclusion is some essential nutrients are not organic. Now, notice organic doesn't name a class by itself. So in order to put that into standard form, this proposition, it has to name a class. And I'm going to go with organic substances because we have organic substance, that term right here. So it would keep us consistent with the rest of the argument. This also tells us what our major premise is going to be. This is our major term. So our major premise is going to be no mineral is an organic substance. And then our minor premise is going to be, my animations are off again, some minerals are essential nutrients. So some minerals are essential nutrients. And then we want to figure out the mood and figure. Well, no, E, I, O. And then what is the figure? Well, minerals is right here and then it's straight down. Well, if you remember, first figure starts in the subject term and slashes down to the predicate term. Second figure is straight up. So it forms this kind of check mark. And then the other side, or like I said, to find a figure 3, it forms kind of a parallel or mirror image of that right there, or a W. So that's down and up. And this right here is going to be figure 3. That, I don't know if I'm trying to give you guys a helpful way to remember the 4 figures. I don't know if I'm succeeding or not, but however you need to remember it, this is figure 3.